How did the wealthiest, most technologically advanced nation on Earth collapse into an economic wasteland in a matter of months? We love to tell ourselves a simplified, comfortable history lesson. We assume the Great Depression was a sudden stock market crash in 1929, an isolated event where a few reckless investors lost their paper wealth. That narrative obscures the real tragedy. While October 1929 serves as a convenient historical marker, the crash itself was merely the catalyst for a terrifying 12-year psychological chain reaction. This reaction systematically dismantled thousands of commercial banks, obliterated local businesses, erased a quarter of all jobs, destroyed millions of family farms, and completely shattered human confidence across the globe. To understand a systemic collapse of this magnitude, we have to put away the dry catalog of economic charts. We have to map the fragile psychological architecture of human trust. To see why the fall was so devastating, you must start in the dizzying optimism of the 1920s. For the first time, ordinary families could buy automobiles, electric refrigerators, and washing machines. They did this using a revolutionary new financial tool, consumer credit. The slogan was simple: buy now, pay later. As consumer spending surged, stock prices began an upward march. A dangerous optimism bias took hold. When humans observed their neighbors and colleagues getting rich by buying stocks, rational risk assessment was completely overwhelmed by the fear of missing out. This confidence was built on margin buying. If you had $100, a stockbroker would loan you $900, allowing you to purchase $1,000 worth of stock. If the stock rose 10%, you doubled your money overnight. But leverage is a trap. If that same stock fell 10%, your entire $100 equity was wiped out, and the broker issued an emergency margin call demanding immediate cash. By mid-1929, the entire financial system was a tightrope suspended over an abyss of margin debt. In late October, a sudden wave of selling hit the New York Stock Exchange. Stock prices dipped, automated margin calls triggered. Brokers liquidated shares to protect their loans, forcing millions of shares onto the market simultaneously. Greed turned into blind panic. Optimism turned into existential terror in less than 72 hours. Yet here is the critical historical reality. Only 10% of American households owned stocks in 1929. If the crisis had stopped on Wall Street, it would have been a painful recession for wealthy investors. The true catastrophe began when the psychological shock of Wall Street spread into the commercial banking system. In the late 1920s, there was no federal deposit insurance. When news of the stock market crash reached small towns, rumors circulated that local banks had lost money by loaning cash to failed brokers. Citizens understood fractional reserve banking. They knew banks kept only a small percentage of deposits in cash while loaning out the rest. The terrifying truth set in. If everyone tried to withdraw their money at the same time, the bank would run out of physical currency, and the last people in line would get nothing. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks failed across the United States. $7 billion in personal savings vanished into thin air. Frugal, hardworking families who never bought a single share of stock woke up to discover their life savings were gone. When thousands of banks close, money itself begins to disappear from society. Falling prices sound like a blessing in a healthy economy, but in a debt-fueled society, deflation is a death sentence. Look at the mathematical trap of debt deflation. If the farmer took out a mortgage in 1926, the monthly payment remained fixed. But by 1932, farm produce prices plummeted by over 50%. If a bushel of wheat dropped from $1 to 30 cents, a farmer had to do triple the physical labor just to pay the exact same debt. When they defaulted, banks foreclosed on the properties. A fear originally based on a rumor triggered a panic. By acting on that fear, citizens caused the exact bank failures they were terrified of. As the system fractured, a psychological paralysis took hold. Defensive saving. If you fear losing your job tomorrow, you hoard every physical dollar you have. The velocity of money drops to zero. You stop buying clothes, so the tailor goes bankrupt. The tailor stops buying meat, forcing the butcher to close. By 1933, 13 million people were out of work. Unemployment reached 25% nationwide, and 50% to 60% in industrial cities. In 1930s society, a man's employment was his dignity, his status, and his community, his self-worth. When a man lost his job, he internalized the failure as a personal moral defect. Desperation became visible on every street corner. Men who had been engineers, managers, and accountants stood in the freezing cold holding wooden crates, selling apples for 5 cents each just to survive. While cultural narratives focused on the uninhabitable Dust Bowl, millions of women became the desperate architects of family survival. Wives stretched a single pound of meat into a week of meals, sewed children's clothing from flour sacks, and took in laundry for pennies. Their exhaustion was invisible, their sacrifice entirely expected. Then came nature's final blow. Severe drought struck the Great Plains. Millions of tons of topsoil were lifted into the atmosphere, creating colossal rolling black clouds of dirt that suffocated livestock, entered sealed windows, and buried the landscape. Hundreds of thousands of families abandoned their farms and migrated west. The Dust Bowl and the economic collapse conspired to strip away every layer of human security. When the economy fails for a decade, the damage moves past the bank account and begins to erode the human spirit, systematically dismantling the identity of anyone caught in its path. Why did government leaders struggle to halt the catastrophe? President Herbert Hoover was trapped by orthodox economic dogma. Economists believed business depressions were self-correcting. The advice from the Treasury Secretary was brutal. Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate farmers. Let the market naturally purge the system. While Hoover clung to orthodox principles, public anger erupted. In 1932, 20,000 impoverished World War I veterans marched on Washington demanding their promised service bonuses. The government responded by ordering the military to deploy tear gas and tanks, burning the veterans' shacks to the ground. The paralysis was not confined to America. When American banks withdrew short-term loans from Europe, the international credit cascade devastated Germany's fragile Weimar Republic. 6 million German workers found themselves destitute, roaming the streets without hope. In Japan, global trade plunged and silk exports collapsed. Rural poverty exploded. Ultranationalist military officers argued that imperial expansion into Manchuria was the only way to guarantee economic survival. When democratic institutions refused to protect citizens from prolonged economic starvation, society inevitably breeds political extremism and violence. In November 1932, the American electorate delivered a decisive verdict, electing Franklin D. Roosevelt. Roosevelt understood that the Great Depression was a crisis of psychological confidence and collective human trust. He asserted that the only thing the nation had to fear was fear itself. On his first full day in office, Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday. He then broadcast directly over the radio into 20 million living rooms, speaking as a trusted friend, explaining why it was safe to deposit money again. He stepped in to calm an anxious public. Lines formed the next morning, but citizens were redepositing their hoarded cash. Roosevelt then launched institutions to rebuild systemic trust. The FDIC guaranteed that if a bank failed, the government would reimburse depositors. Social Security codified a new contract. Society accepted a collective responsibility to protect citizens from catastrophic ruin. Programs like the Works Progress Administration put millions to work building bridges and schools. The WPA provided a paycheck, and it restored human dignity by giving citizens a sense that their labor mattered to the nation. The New Deal restored the psychological floor, but full economic recovery took another decade. It ultimately required the staggering scale of wartime mobilization between 1941 and 1945. Massive, sustained government spending was required to restart global industrial production. Roosevelt proved a vital truth about civilization. You cannot rebuild factories, open stock exchanges, or engineer an economy without first rebuilding the invisible architecture of human trust. The generation that survived the 1930s carried the scars of systemic betrayal for the rest of their lives. They hoarded rubber bands, hid cash inside mattresses, and viewed debt as a mortal danger. This hyper-caution was the natural result of experiencing a world where every assumption of security had collapsed overnight. Today, our financial systems are vastly more complex, computerized, and interconnected. Yet underneath high-frequency trading and digital currencies, the human brain remains governed by the exact same primitive human emotions: greed, overconfidence, panic, and fear. Digital bank runs now occur at the speed of a smartphone tap. The 1930s demonstrated how quickly paper wealth can turn to ash, leaving the individual with nothing but their own resilience. Relying entirely on volatile external systems for your sense of self-worth is like exhausting yourself chasing a single butterfly across a field. When the wind shifts, the prize vanishes. Real security requires a different approach, building an internal garden of moral autonomy and community ties. This foundation remains standing even when the markets outside have vanished, providing its own sustenance when the system fails to provide for the individual. The history of the Great Depression suggests that true stability comes from your internal character and your capacity to endure hardship with dignity. These are the only assets that a bank balance can neither create nor destroy. Stand firm in your own moral courage and discernment. I will see you in the very next one.